Hello everyone, welcome to the channel, Ontario Law and the Older Person. And this video is going to be about a report that was released January 20th, 2026, titled Perspectives on Growing Older in Canada, Part 1 of 2. The information provided in this video is not legal advice. It is relayed for the purposes of general information. No legal decisions should be made based on this material. Any viewer who needs legal advice should contact a lawyer. So this is the full title of the report. It is from the National Institute on Aging, and it's their 4th annual report, Perspectives on Growing Older in Canada, the 2025 NIA Aging in Canada survey. And the link is in the description. This is not founded so much in law, but it is telling us about what older people are experiencing and how they feel about it in Canada. Here is the list of authors. I'm going to raise some points about the sample for this study. So who was questioned? Who was a participant in this study? And whenever you're looking at studies, it's always good to see if they describe the sample, the nature of it, how big it is, things like that. So direct quote, 6,001 Canadians aged 50 plus living in community settings across all provinces and territories. So they were in the sample. Excluded from the sample, all people living in institutions. So this would include people living in long-term care facilities, people living in hospitals. I mean, you don't want to live in a hospital, but some people are there for quite a period of time. They weren't part of this sample. I assume that this also excludes people in retirement homes. Now, this is a frustration I've expressed in another video. I referred to 3 reports from Statistics Canada, and in all 3, they excluded those living in institutions. And if we're going to talk about older people and their experiences, I think it is a problem that so often people living in these institutions are excluded. Now, the writers gave us their reason for the exclusion. Most people want to age in community settings. Who cares? We're talking about what they're experiencing now and their hopes for the future. Some people will not have the option to age in community settings. Do you think this is a good reason for this exclusion? And then while the document states people of the territories were included in the study, the sample for those individuals was so small that the writers couldn't really make any firm conclusions on those people's experiences. So they also say those who participated, the percentage kind of reflects the percentage of people living in territories for the Canadian government population overall. Okay, then. Do you think people should go to the effort of going out of their way to get more people from the territories as part of the sample? Personally, I think they should. Direct quote, as respondents were drawn from an opt-in online panel rather than a random probability frame, results cannot be considered statistically generalizable in the same way as a true probability sample. And so due to this approach, participants were largely limited to those with access to and comfort with using the internet. So would this process be basically overwhelming or inaccessible to certain older people? And of course, it would depend on their resources. Do people have reliable online access? So who might be, again, left out of this sample? I just cut up a few pieces from a chart where they talked about who was in the sample. They had a lot of characteristics. I just wanted to focus on when it comes to owning a home and renting a home. So far more people are owners of homes than renters of homes. And as we look at more material in this video, we're going to find out that that makes a big difference, what kind of living arrangement people have. And then a bit lower down the chart, we see that by far the majority of people participating in this study are white. And then others are lumped all together. So people are going to have very different experiences depending on their ethnicity. They're all thrown together in this sample. So I think this is problematic. These are the National Institute on Aging's 10 indicators of aging well in Canada. So one category, social well-being. So under that category, social network and strength, social engagement, experienced ageism, And then next category, financial security, income adequacy, material deprivation, retirement readiness. And these are the subjects I'm going to be talking about in this video. The others are going to be in the second video. In the second video, I'll be talking about this category, health and independence. Under that category, access to healthcare, access to home and community-based care, aging in the right place, and then 10, overall experience of aging in Canada. So buckle up. Despite the fact that I've cut the material in half, this video is still going to be a long one. So hopefully you'll find it interesting enough to get through to the end. So here are direct quotes from the content under social network and strength. Social isolation refers to having few social connections with family, friends, or the broader community. Loneliness refers to the subjective feeling of being disconnected, regardless of the number of relationships a person may have. Loneliness and social isolation are linked to higher rates of depression, anxiety, cognitive decline, and dementia, as well as increased cardiovascular disease, weakened immune function, and poorer recovery from illness. Finally, they are tied to poorer health, higher mortality, and reduced quality of life. Here are some statistics. 57% of Canadians aged 50 years and older feel somewhat or very lonely. 43% are at risk of social isolation. In 2025, 36% of Canadians 50 plus had weak social networks, 13% very weak, and 23% somewhat weak, compared with 33% who reported strong networks. More statistics. 24% of Canadians 50 years to 64 said they were very lonely, and almost half, 48%, were at high risk of isolation. 14% of Canadians 65 to 79 were very lonely, and 40% were at high risk. 9% among those 80 plus reported being very lonely, and 31% were at high risk of social isolation. This is another situation where I would like more explanation, because something that is interesting, the rates of loneliness decrease as people get older, when people might assume the opposite would be true. So why is that? Is it because people 80 years and older are more likely to have caregivers, someone dedicated to taking care of them and would be there every single day? And they would be a social contact right there. And maybe the caregivers would be able to help older people access opportunities for social activities. Something to think about. Meanwhile, the youngest group, 50 to 64, they have the highest rates of being lonely. Now, we know from other material that this group is most likely to be taking care of others. So is it possible that they're still feeling lonely even though they're regularly interacting with, by the way, taking care of their own parents? Possibility. Then we have, given that many of those in the 50 to 64 cohort would be in the workforce, it is important to note that being engaged in the workforce may not be sufficient to prevent social isolation. Again, why would this be? Now, we do know that jobs are getting more and more toxic. We have ridiculous demands placed on employees with little in the way of benefits, good pay, things like that. So that could be dissuading people from being engaged in social activity in the workplace. It's a toxic place. They go there, they make their money, then they escape. Also, is remote working having this kind of impact? So I know lots of people who love the concept of working remotely, but others miss that interaction. So does that have something to do with people feeling lonely? And of course, a lot of people are being required to move back into the workforce. So will that have a change on these numbers? And of course, health has an impact. 34% of Canadians 50 plus in fair or poor health said they were very lonely, compared with only 8% in excellent or very good health. 54% of those in poor health were at high risk of isolation, compared with 35% in excellent health. So, of course, if you're healthier, which does imply more mobile, yeah, you can go out and about, hang out with people, join organizations. So, the connection is pretty obvious there. And then, of course, income matters. Among Canadians 50 plus who have inadequate income, 48% reported being very lonely, and 65% faced high isolation risk. Canadians 50 plus with incomes good enough to save. And all of these topics, by the way, are further explained in the report. It's just I cut it out for the purposes of time. Anyways, Canadians 50 plus with incomes good enough to save, where only 9% reported being very lonely and 35% were at high risk of social isolation. And then again, so money matters. Are you able to participate in activities that you enjoy? So some activities, of course, are free. You can volunteer. But when it comes to someone seeking particular interests, sometimes money is a barrier. 25% older Canadians surveyed who were living alone reported being very lonely, and 51% were at high risk of isolation. 30% of men living alone reported severe loneliness and 55% at high risk of social isolation, higher than among women living alone. And yet again, there's no evaluation, no digging into why men are more likely to feel alone. And that's not a rabbit hole I'm going to go down. I am avoiding doing additional research for the purpose of evaluating this material because it would make the video very, very long. But we all have heard of reasons why men are lonelier when they're by themselves. We know that in a lot of cases, if you have a cisgendered heterosexual relationship, so many men basically rely on their female partners to arrange their social lives, to sometimes be the only source of social connection. So this is something that deserves a lot more attention, but unfortunately, it's not in this report. 25% of renters reported severe loneliness and 51% at high risk of isolation. 14% of homeowners reported severe loneliness and 38% at high risk of isolation. And then this difference may partly reflect underlying factors such as income levels, net worth, and living arrangements, which tend to differ between renters and homeowners. And here's something I'd like to put out there. So renters usually are renting an apartment in an apartment building, whereas homeowners, right, they have houses. And I just wonder if there is different kinds of neighborly relations. Are people living in homes more likely to have some kind of relationship with their neighbors rather than renters? Because I got to say, any apartment building I've lived in, renters don't talk to each other. Is that a factor? Now, the report touches on the concept of material deprivation without defining it at this time. It does later in the report, which to me makes no sense, but I'm trying to follow along with the page count, doing this in a lineal fashion. So we're going to talk about this now, even though we're not quite sure yet what material deprivation is. But what it says here is it's another way of looking at the connection between these vulnerabilities, with 40% of those experiencing material deprivation according to the MDI, that will be defined later, reporting being very lonely, and 62% at high risk of isolation, much higher than the national averages. In contrast, among those not materially deprived, only 13% were very lonely and 38% faced a high isolation risk. Social engagement. This is the definition. Having strong social networks is important, but so too is having frequent, regular, and meaningful interactions with those in one's social networks and communities. For older adults, being socially active and staying engaged is associated with better physical and mental health. By the way, I'm pretty sure that would be true of everyone, not just older people. And also, I want to think about the possibility of someone whose interactions are mostly online. And so someone might be in an environment where their activities aren't available to them, or, sometimes it can be easier to interact online rather than face to face. So we have a lot of discussion about whether being mostly online is healthy or not. It's an area of further investigation. Again, I'm not going to go down any rabbit holes for this video, but just putting it out there, can purely online interactions take the place of face-to-face interactions? Here we have a chart, frequency of social engagement among Canadians aged 50 and older 2025. So those who see or interact with someone at least once a day, that category is by far the smallest at 5%. Then we have those who see someone at least once a week, and that's 28%, at least once a month, that's 20%, at least several times a year, 14%, and then almost never, the really chilling statistic of 26%. So a quarter of the people polled were saying they almost never see anyone, not even a few times a year. And I'm going to say something very difficult. This is a trigger warning. This is a tough topic to just refer to. So, warning, warning, warning. Okay, we've all heard stories of older people who live alone dying and no one noticing, sometimes for weeks. I watched a very depressing video that involved a situation in a different country where someone wasn't noticed for years. And I don't know how that would be possible. Obviously, they owned their home, but who didn't notice payments being made or something like that? But we know this is a phenomenon. And so these are very hard numbers to look at. And here we have another chart, participation in social activities by age 2025. And here we have an interesting result. So for those who participated as often as I wanted to, that's the factor, we are divided according to age groups with these bars. And by far, those who participate as often as they wanted to is for those who are 80 years of age and above. And again, is this a situation where they might have caregivers who are helping them engage? On the other hand, remember, people living in long-term care facilities are not included in this chart. So are they engaging in social activities as well? Do you think it's legitimate to keep those people out when we're talking about issues like this? Those aged 50 to 64 often face overlapping pressures of employment, caregiving, and emerging health challenges, leaving them with limited time and energy to devote to social life. For some, the transition out of the workplace can be an isolating experience that disrupts existing social connections. Just throwing this out there, but I think we know in a lot of cases, men kind of rely solely on their jobs as sources of contact. And then when they retire, they lose that contact and maybe have difficulty creating new ones. And then the impact of health. 62% of older adults in excellent or very good health felt satisfied with their level of participation, compared with only 34% of those in fair or poor health. For those struggling with their health, 31% that they participated much less than they wanted. And here we have another chart showing the impact of income. And of course, it's fairly predictable in its results. So that bar on the far left, that represents people with income good enough to save. And 59% of those were able to participate as often as they wanted to. And then you go to the far right here, and that represents people with income not enough and having a hard time, and they participated much less than they would have liked. And then renters, people without a high school education, and those who were unemployed, stay at home, or on disability participated much less than they wanted. These numbers show how strongly life circumstances shape the ability to stay socially engaged. And here's another area where I would have appreciated some elaboration. So, why do those without a high school education interact less than they would like? What's happening there? Here's a chart with the top 5 barriers to social engagement among Canadians 50 and older 2025. So the big one is lack of funds. Activities cost more than I could afford. And as you can imagine, once people hit retirement age, their income usually is fixed according to whatever pensions they might be relying on, while everything else gets more and more expensive. And then we have health condition limits what I can do, lack of energy to do more. Do not have anyone to go with, do not want to do them alone. And here's a thing I think is a problem in our culture where people are almost afraid to do things alone. People don't feel comfortable in their own company, and they don't want to go to restaurants alone. They don't want to go to movies alone. this sort of thing. And here's the thing, I enjoy going to restaurants with my friends, but I also enjoy going by myself. I bring my book, it's a nice relaxing time. Someone else brings me all this food. I don't have to do the dishes. But I know there are people looking at me and they're feeling sorry for me because I'm alone. So, could we take away some of the stigma of doing things by yourself? And then, therefore, this might not be as big a factor when it comes to older people deciding whether to engage or not. And then the bottom, too busy, other responsibilities. The report touches on experienced ageism. Ageism is discrimination, prejudice, or stereotyping directed at individuals based on their age. This report doesn't really talk a lot about the different kinds of ageism, and neither will I, because I have videos that will be addressing ageism in the workplace, ageism in healthcare, and all sorts of other stuff like that. Experiences of everyday ageism in the past 12 months among Canadians aged 50 and older 2025. So, by far the biggest percentage, I hear, see, and or read jokes about old age, aging, or older people. Here's a very common one, talking about having a senior moment. Oh, something just left my brain. I can't remember what I was going to say, or I went into a different room and forgot why I was there. That seems to me actually a pretty common phenomenon with people of all ages, but for some reason it's always identified as a senior moment. Next category, I hear, see, and or read things suggesting that older adults and aging are unattractive or undesirable. And yeah, we see that all over the place. And one thing I talk about in another video is the concept of successful aging. Our concept of successful aging involves people in their 70s who have the energy and appearance of those in their 40s. And the implication being, once they can no longer act like that or look like that, then suddenly they failed at aging. So that is an issue. People insist on helping me with things I can do on my own. And that's not a category I've seen pop up in a lot of ways, but it is true. I started going gray when I was like 13, thanks to my dad's DNA. So I went completely gray at a fairly young age, and people see gray, think old. And I've had all sorts of offers from younger people, carrying my bags, opening the door, giving me their seat on the bus, stuff like that. So this involves people being kind and showing respect for their elders, but if they insist on it, it can get into the range of flat out insulting. And then people assume I have difficulty with cell phones and computers. People assume I have difficulty hearing and or seeing things. People assume I do not do anything important or valuable. People assume I have difficulty remembering and or understanding things. The report just touches on elder abuse. It doesn't really go into much detail, and I won't for this video. I'm creating videos that are dedicated to various kinds of elder abuse. So here's a quote. Elder abuse is closely linked to ageism, as discriminatory attitudes that devalue older people can create the conditions where neglect, mistreatment, and exploitation are more likely to occur. Elder abuse is defined by the World Health Organization as a single or repeated act or lack of appropriate action occurring within any relationship of trust that causes harm or distress to an older person. So you have a few different aspects to this definition. So it can be just one act, and it can also mean not acting when you should. And that's the thing is, are you in a situation where you're required to act on behalf of an older person? And that again is something I'll address in a different video. But if you don't have responsibility for an older person for some reason, then is a failure to act a form of abuse? Something to think about. And then what is the nature of a relationship of trust? So a form of elder abuse can be scams perpetrated against older people. For example, someone showing up at your door saying your roof needs to be rebuilt or fixed or something like that, and convincing this older person to hand over a bunch of cash. Would that be a relationship of trust? Something to think about. At this point, the report kind of touches on retirement because it ties into income, but it will go into more detail a little later in this video. So, according to them, retirement income framework. Canada's retirement income programs, such as the Guaranteed Income Supplement, Old Age Security, and CPP, were not designed to fully replace pre retirement earnings for all Canadians. Estimates suggest these programs collectively replace only about 40% of average pre retirement income. Though for low income older adults, this proportion is much higher. So, what does that make you think of? 40%. It obviously does depend on how much money the person has earned, but going down 60%, is there this expectation that older people will continue working, but maybe in a different environment? Quote, to maintain their standard of living in retirement, most Canadians need additional income beyond what the public system provides. Historically, workplace pension plans helped bridge this gap. However, these plans have become increasingly rare, and this is something we know about. And a form of ageism against older people in the workplace is firing them because of their wages or the benefits they have, and then turning around and hiring younger people without these benefits. We also are aware that many younger people are like in a gig economy or getting contract work. So these pensions aren't available to them. So this problem is just going to get worse. And then another quote, for many, income in later life is largely fixed, shaped by pensions, savings, or government benefits, and is less flexible in the face of unexpected expenses or economic shocks. Investment market volatility, rising housing costs, and inflation all test the adequacy of income, making an older adult's perception as important as the numbers themselves. And then we are all aware, it's not touched on in this report, that a lot of older people are helping out their kids, right? Giving them money in order to enable them to buy houses or paying off student loans. Another thing not touched on in this report that I've read of in other areas, people used to buy insurance that was meant to help them maintain a standard of life once they retired, right? But those insurance companies have either shut down these policies or say, okay, if you want the same amount of protection, you have to pay more. So there's a lot of stuff, financial pressures that are happening that older people, even when they planned, did all the right things, they're finding themselves under a form of financial strain that they didn't anticipate in the past. Another chart with the top 5 future financial concerns among Canadians. So the big one is the rising cost of living, except that's what everyone is concerned about, really, regardless of age. Running out of money. So, as I already mentioned, people might have been making all the right choices and ending up with financial pressures they hadn't anticipated. And in this case, we also have the issue of people living longer and therefore maybe being in a state of retirement longer than they ever expected, right? So, someone might be retiring at the age of 65 and living to be 100. And then we have what I think is a strange issue in this particular category, not having family or friends to help take care of me as I get older. So, is this tied into finances? Are they talking about being able to rely on their adult children financially as well as in other ways? Okay, not being able to afford major medical or long-term care expenses and reduction in CPP and or QPP benefits. And we have heard some discussion that maybe there should be a cutoff point, people being able to withdraw only for a certain number of years. So we can see a very unpleasant situation where people are older and frailer and having more difficulty finding work when CPP is ended. That's a pretty scary possibility. Quote, financial vulnerability is rarely tied to current circumstances alone. Its roots stretch back decades. Factors like limited access to workplace pensions, periods of ill health, and histories of precarious or unstable work can all leave people approaching later life with fewer financial resources. Shortcomings in financial literacy add another layer of difficulty, limiting the ability to prepare effectively for retirement. Now we get to the definition of material deprivation and the Material Deprivation Index, MDI. The MDI evaluates poverty based on material outcomes, whether a household is unable to afford certain necessities that most Canadians consider part of a decent standard of living, such as heating or cooling their home, adding protein to their diet, or covering an unexpected expense. In this way, it captures what households can actually afford rather than simply what they earn. And I find it interesting that they throw in diet. Something I find frustrating is when people claim anyone can afford a healthy diet. Obviously, they haven't had to budget their groceries for a while. I do find that kind of condescending and just ignoring reality for a lot of people. The MDI is built on a list of 11 goods, services, and activities that most Canadians see as essential for a decent standard of living. These go beyond basic needs like food and shelter to include items and services that, if absent, would place a household's living conditions below what is widely considered acceptable in Canada. Another quote: the MDI distinguishes between households that cannot afford certain goods or services and those that do not have them for other reasons, such as personal preferences or lack of access. So it's one thing to say personal preference. Yes, people have decided to live a much more stripped down lifestyle, for example. But lack of access, I know that might not be directly connected to income, but if you have a situation where your municipality doesn't offer drinkable water, so then you have to go somewhere and buy it, um, is that quite right to put it in the same kind of category as personal preference? Don't know. It measures deprivation to access a standard of living by counting the number of items a household lacks because it can't afford them. The more deprivation items a household is unable to afford, the greater the likelihood that it faces a poverty level standard of living. According to the material deprivation threshold of two items or more, the NIA survey reveals that in 2025, 20% of Canadians 50 plus likely have a poverty level standard of living. They are experiencing material deprivation and could not afford two or more essential items, such as regular new clothes, adequate heating, or an unexpected expense. Here's an interesting little tidbit. Nationally, Saskatchewan reports the lowest rate of material deprivation at 15%, while residents of New Brunswick, Newfoundland and Labrador, and Nova Scotia face the highest rate at 24%. So I'd like to know more about this. When we think of Saskatchewan, we don't think of a particularly wealthy province. So, does the wealth of the province have anything to do with the rate of material deprivation, or are there other factors at play? Quote, those aged 50 to 64 are most likely to be experiencing a poverty level standard of living, 29%, compared with 13% among those 65 to 79 and just 4% among those 80 and older. This is likely due to the availability of anti-poverty initiatives such as OAS and GIS that are successfully reducing poverty among those aged 65 and older. And I kind of question this statement, not based on any real evidence on my part, but they said earlier in this report that people between the ages of 50 and 64 are more likely to be working, and then also saying that these government supported programs aren't enough to actually continue with a good lifestyle. So to me, this is a bit of a contradiction with what other parts of the report are saying. Do you agree? And then 50 women 50 plus are more likely than men 50 plus to experience poverty. It would be nice if they went into some elaboration on that. And probably part of it is that women usually make lower amounts of money, but also take time out of the workplace to care for others. But I'm just throwing that in there. And then those in poor or fair health are nearly 4 times more likely to live in poverty than those in excellent or very good health. Then here's another statement I think is kind of weird. Canadians 50 plus living alone face somewhat higher rates of deprivation, with men living alone more affected than women. So we just heard that women are more likely to be living in poverty, yet here men are more likely to have deprivation. And I would really love an explanation for that. Why is there this difference? And then 35% of those with less than a high school education experienced poverty level living, compared with 10% of those with a university degree. And of course, it makes sense. Usually, the higher your level of education, the more money you're likely to make. though of course there are exceptions. That's not across the entire board. And then 36% of renters face deprivation compared with just 11% of homeowners because renters tend to have lower levels of income. Okay, now we're going back to retirement readiness, and that is the last subject for this video. So, quotes: recent reports from OMERS and Entente Education Canada suggest that many older adults are reimagining retirement as a gradual transition rather than a fixed endpoint, blending part time work, caregiving, or volunteering with reduced paid employment, while access to pensions and financial literacy remain key determinants of readiness. Findings from the NIA's 2025 Aging in Canada survey mirror these trends, showing that many Canadians aged 50 and older are delaying their retirement because they are not financially prepared. About 1 in 5 have saved $5,000 or less, leaving a substantial share of the population at risk of financial insecurity later in life. In 2025, 35% of Canadians 50 plus said they were working. 52% said they were retired, and 12% were in other situations, which means what? Don't know. Okay. Naturally, employment rates were the highest among Canadians aged 50 to 64, compared with those aged 65 to 79 and 80 plus. Planning for retirement relates to financial capacity as well as social and emotional considerations. Retirement intentions among working Canadians 50 plus have changed slightly since 2022. Each year, the largest share, 35 to 40%, report hoping to retire but have not yet made concrete plans, though this proportion has declined from 39% in 2024 to 35% in 2025. In 2025, 18% report having formal plans in place, a small increase from earlier years, where roughly one quarter, 27%, continue to say they have no intention of ever retiring. At any given time, about 5% are actively in transition to retirement. So those people who claim they're never going to retire, how does that work? Are they saying they're going to keep working until the day they just die? Is that a realistic expectation? And so I think some older people just don't want to accept that they might not always be able to do the same things. What you can do in your 60s, you might not be able to do in your 80s. And also, we have changes in economics and industries. Maybe the job you're doing now is a job that disappears sometime in the future. So I'm not saying it's an impossible thing. I think it's unrealistic. It kind of reminds me of people who, live in a house that they absolutely love. And they're saying, oh, I will never leave this house. You'll have to carry me out in a box. Is that realistic? What you can do in your 60s, you might not be able to do in your 80s, such as mowing the lawn and house upkeep. You might have a situation where you have to move. So I think this is a weird idea to have that you will never retire. You might have to. Lower levels of education are associated with more uncertainty. Those without a high school diploma, 13%, are far more likely not to have a plan for retirement as compared with those with a university education, 24%. The NIA survey also found that pension holders are more likely to report having specific plans for retirement, 16% among those with pensions versus 13% among those without. So first of all, give us some reasons why those without a high school diploma are less likely to plan. Why? And then it seems kind of obvious to me that people who are getting a pension will have planned out their retirement because they know that they're going to get this pension. Like, I don't know. There's something a little off about this whole paragraph. Health status and income continue to define retirement readiness. Among those reporting excellent or very good health, 24% had retirement plans versus just 10% of those in poorer health. And then a similar trend emerges with respect to income adequacy. One third, 33% of Canadians with an income good enough to save had formal retirement plans compared with only 2% of those whose incomes were not enough and having a hard time. And, you can see why it would be hard to plan when you're just barely getting by. Your plan is just to make it from one day to the next. And I can't see someone who's barely making it having hopes that they'll be able to retire at all. And the report touches on that point. Among Canadians 50 plus who have not yet retired, the share of those who feel they can afford to retire at their desired time has declined from 35% in 2022 to 29% in 2025. And of course, we can all think of factors that might be contributing to those concerns. Over the same period, those saying they cannot afford to retire at their desired time rose from 37% to 43%, which is pretty significant, while about one quarter remain unsure. These shifts point to a steady erosion of retirement confidence. Here's a bit of a weird statement here. 27% of those 50 to 64% feel they can afford to retire at their desired time, compared with 39% at ages 65 to 79 and 47% of 80 plus. So this is kind of weird. They've already established that those in the age group of 50 to 64 are the ones most likely to be working. Um, Yet on the other end of the scale, we have people who are 80 years and older, and 47% of them think they can afford to retire at their desired time. Are many people still working at the age of 80? I just find this a little weird. Okay, 33% of men feel they can afford to retire at their desired time, compared with only 25% of women. And no explanation why. I mean, we can think of reasons, but nothing in the report. 40% of homeowners feel they can afford to retire at their desired time, compared with only 12% of renters, because as we've established, more homeowners will have more money, basically. And as you can see, having gone through most of this report, there isn't much to be said about people of different ethnicities or different, religions or different gender identities or anything like that. We have very little discussion about the differences different older people are going to be experiencing outside of their actual age or gender, and binary form of gender at that. 64% of those who say their income is good enough to save feel they can afford to retire at their desired time, compared with only 3% of those who report their income is not enough and stretched. And that's a very depressing statistic. And then we have 36% of pension holders feel they can afford to retire at their desired time versus 11% of non-holders, and that's obvious. We can understand why. And then 42% of university graduates feel they can afford to retire at their desired time, compared with only 18% of those who did not complete high school. In 2025, nearly half of retirees say life is more enjoyable than before retirement. About one third say it's about the same, and fewer than 1 in 5 report it is worse. Um, and what does that mean? So is this purely a financial situation where certain people have more money? Is it also what their job situation was? What if they hated their job? So it's not so much about money. It might be, oh, I've stuck with that job for a certain period of time to get these certain benefits, but now that I have them and I'm done, yay, delighted. So there isn't much discussion or any really about what people's experiences are working, about whether they liked their job or not, aside from any potential for ageism and what kind of impact that might have on the rest of their lives. It's not just about money. Okay, in 2025, older retirees, particularly those 65 to 79 years of age, 48%, and 80 plus, almost 50, are the most likely to report greater enjoyment. Why is that? And again, remember, people living in any kind of facility are not part of this study. Would these numbers be different if those other people were included? I would say yes, probably. And then socioeconomic factors remain influential. 52% of university graduates describe retirement as more enjoyable, compared with 28% of those with less than a high school education. This is likely due to higher levels of education being associated with greater financial security, which is what I've said, better health outcomes, and greater control over the timing and terms of their exit from work. This is the last bit for this video. Nearly half, 49% of those in excellent or very good health report that life after retirement is more enjoyable, compared with just 28% of those in fair or poor health. Similarly, those with an income good enough to save report the most positive experiences, while retirees with insufficient incomes are more likely to say retirement is less enjoyable. And, sometimes these statements are so obvious, you're thinking, wow, they had to do a study. But at least we're getting some percentages from here. It is unfortunate that we're not getting more information from different kinds of cultures. For example, this is an issue I'll raise in another video. There are some cultures where what is considered a good life isn't founded on having money and being particularly healthy. There are other issues that are important to them. So it is unfortunate that we don't get that kind of information in this report, but it is what it is. This is what we're working with this week. Now, if you made it to the end of this very long video, I appreciate it. I know it was a little dry, but hopefully you got something you found interesting from it. So thanks everybody. Have a great day.